Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am really delighted to be back with you all tonight for the fourth session of this March Book Talk series. Please, as always, say hello in the chat box. Make sure you chat to everyone. We love to know who is with us in the room. Also, the chat box is where you'll add your questions and comments throughout the evening. I will pull questions into our conversation as you add them. We are so delighted to be able to continue gathering together from all over the world for these opportunities for meaningful conversation and learning. So thank you for being with us. A few words about JWA for anyone who's new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe very strongly that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So thank you for being our partners in this work. The book talks are just one small piece of what we do, so I hope that you will take the opportunity to check out jwa.org and delve into the full range of projects and resources that we offer. There's always a lot there. One very quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, you can click on the button that says CC, where it says show captions, and that should bring up the captions for you. Tonight, we truly have an embarrassment of riches with our program. We are incredibly honored to have three illustrious authors joining us for conversation about their work, and I am excited to introduce them. I start with Irena Klepfisz. She is a practicing secular Jew, poet, teacher, activist, Yiddish translator, and scholar of Yiddish women writers. She immigrated to New York City at the age of 8. She was raised in a Bronx community of Holocaust survivors. She is a founding editor of Conditions magazine. She also co-founded the Jewish Women's Committee to End the Occupation. She co-edited the amazing anthology, The Tribe of Dinah, a Jewish women's anthology, which is on my shelf right over there. She taught Jewish women's studies for 22 years at Barnard College and women's studies in English for 10 years at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She recently published Her Birth and Later Years, Poems Collected Anew, 1971 to 2021, which this year was named a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in Poetry. Ann Bookman is a recent Pushcart Prize nominee, and she's published poems in many places: Valparaiso Poetry Review, Larcom Review, Soul Lit, Chronogram, Dogwood, among many others. In 2012, she published a chapbook, Point of Attachment, with Finishing Line Press, and her first full collection, Bloodlines, which is in part a family history tracing her Ashkenazi Jewish roots, was published last spring. After a 40-year career in academia, she's currently a senior fellow at the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at UMass Boston. And last but not least, Joy Ladin has long worked at the tangled intersection of literature, Judaism, and transgender identity. She has published 10 books of poetry, including her latest collection, Shekhinah Speaks, the National Jewish Book Award winner, The Book of Anna, which I think we talked about last time with you, Joy, a couple years ago, and Lambda Literary Award finalist, Transmigration and Impersonation. She's the author of a memoir of gender transition, the National Jewish Book Award finalist, Through the Door of Life, and another work of creative nonfiction, Lambda Literary and Triangle Award finalist, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective. Her work has been recognized with a NEA Fellowship, a Fulbright Scholarship, and Hadassah Brandeis Institute Research Fellowships, among other honors. Our partner, Jewish Live, has many episodes of her online conversation series containing multitudes, which you can find at jewishlive.org. And she's been in our book talks before, so you can find those interviews on our site, jwa.org. Welcome, all of you. We're so thrilled to have you here with us tonight. And I'm already feeling like we're not going to have enough time to fit all the conversation in, but we'll do our best to touch on many topics and, of course, leave you wanting more, which you will be able to find in their book. So let this be a good taste and introduction. So the first question that I think I want to ask all of you is about poetry itself. All three of you obviously write poetry. We're here to talk about poetry tonight. And tonight we're speaking about we'll focus, I think, a little bit on your most recent works, Shekhinah Speaks for Joy, Irena's new collection, Ann's Bloodlines, but you all also write in other forms: essay, scholarly work, memoir. So why poetry? What does poetry offer you, or what do you turn to poetry for that is different from your writing in other forms?
Irena, I feel like I can hear an answer forming inside you, and I'm dying to hear what it is.
For me, poetry is something more physical. I feel like it comes out of I think poetry answers a tension in my body. I know that sounds kind of weird a little bit, but there's a difference between seeing something and wanting to write a poem about it, and seeing something and wanting to write an essay about it. There's a kind of, I think, emotional difference in response to something. I don't know whether any of you have had this experience of being with a bunch of people and something happens and they would turn to me and they say, "Oh, Irena, you should write a poem about that." And I think, well, maybe you should write a poem about it and leave me alone, kind of. But it's interesting what people think is a poem moment and what we think is a poem moment, which I think is always quite different. And I think it's more private. I mean, the stimulus for it, I think, is more private than something that's really very public, that everybody would agree this is a really momentous thing and we should all take note of it in some way. And I think that also there's a way in which I think working on a poem for me is an exploration of things. I expect to uncover things that I didn't know before when I started. Something about me, something that pops out. I always have this feeling, I don't know whether you've had this feeling too, that sometimes I don't even feel responsible for what I wrote because it wasn't conscious. It just kind of came out, and it came out just like I wanted it to, but there's no planning of it at all, and it's like a surprise, you sort of, oh, wow, gee, I guess I really feel that or think that or something. So I think that's what gives the difference if I'm going to write an essay about something, I know where I'm going to end up. I know where I want to end up. And it's sort of like, I just have to figure out how to get from here to there. When I start a poem, I'm not sure where I'm going to end up. I mean, I think I might know where I want to end up, but that might not be the right place even. I may end up somewhere totally different. So I think that's a major difference, I think, between writing. I've written a lot of essays, but it's very different than writing poetry.
It's more of a channeling process, it sounds like, or some kind of
It's definitely a channeling process. Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
Joy and Ann, do you experience poetry similarly in terms of process or motivation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I love the quote from Ellen Bass and I'm going to not do it exactly the way she said it, but it's something like that art and poetry is about holding the tension between elegy and ode, between our kind of sufferings and despair and sorrows on the one hand, and our desire to wonder at the world, to praise the world, to appreciate the world. And I think for me, a lot of my poems have come out of a process of grieving and trying to move beyond grieving. And I agree a lot with what Irena said. I mean, often I start with a memory that keeps like revisiting me. And I try to put something down about it. And then I'm like off, I'm like down a chute. There's something that happens that is, I think, partly a process of association. I think it's really important when you're writing poetry to allow yourself to associate, to go from image to image, from feeling to feeling, and let things arise as they may. And I also agree, like I often like really have no idea where I'm going to end up. One of the poems in Bloodlines is called Migration Routes. And it's a lot about things in my family history and coming to the United States and landing at Ellis Island and all these sort of things. And then at the very end of the poem, there's a line that says, "No one applied for entrance to my body." It's like, I mean, this is a book that's partly about the BRCA gene. And I didn't know that I felt that way about the BRCA gene in relation to my body. I knew a lot of things, but I didn't know that I had this feeling of sort of almost being violated and penetrated in a way that was illegal.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah.
I found that I've always been a voracious reader of all kinds of things. And when the pandemic began, I had a period that I went through of not being able to read anything except for poetry. And it was very interesting to me to see that, like, and I think what you were saying about both grieving and sort of that sense of like, you know, kind of going into something, it felt like there was some way in which I needed to turn off my conscious brain and go into a more of a feeling, you know, associative place or something. And it was interesting to, you know, I sort of eventually climbed back out into other forms of reading, but it was interesting to see how different forms can provide space for different emotional states or different, you know, not just emotional states, but I guess global states in some way.
I always I just always feel like writing poetry, and I've always felt that way. Poetry has always been the way I felt most alive. And at one point I thought of wearing a t-shirt that said, "I'd rather be writing." And this by no means means that it's a good idea for me to be writing poetry all the time. It doesn't mean that I would be writing good poetry. In fact, the more poetry I write, I think the smaller percentage is good, but it is a physical feeling and a preference, and it's disconnected from meaning. Like from an early age, I just didn't care what my words meant. I would happily use words I didn't know what they meant if they sounded or felt right. So in writing prose, I feel like the work is getting the words to say exactly what I mean and to refine my meaning so that my meaning is as precise as possible. When I write poetry, I feel like I know that my meaning is completely inadequate to make a really living poem. So my challenge is to use language in ways that allows meaning that's greater than anything I would come up with to enter the poem. And often that's a process of depersonalization for me. I've started writing, I'm so not disciplined enough to be a formal poet. So they're sort of haiku. They're short 3-line poems. Let's just call it that. But they're following some of the haiku masters in translation, and it's striking how it's just such a different process because there isn't room to get lost. If you're writing 3 lines, it's pretty hard not to know where the poem is going when it starts. And it is a kind of an immediate response. And in fact, when haiku arose, people would sit in a circle and they would all just haiku together. They would be like, "Oh, a leaf is falling." Everybody starts writing leaf falling haiku, and then they would compare. It's very strange, and a public kind of form of doing poetry together. But those very short moments, it's still the same thing. It's still in those few words. Either something happens that means more than I know how to mean, or it's a dud.
I'm interested in this question about sort of the physicality of poems, that that has come up, and particularly because all three of you write about the body in various different ways as a site of pleasure, pain, illness, healing, alienation. And I'm curious about that relationship between the language of poetry and, I mean, we've been talking about it as something that emerges in less of a intellectualized way, maybe, and more of a, you know, I don't know what the right word is, more of a unconscious or subconscious kind of sense. But I'm curious about the relationship between poetry and, you know, using poetry as a tool for engaging with embodied experience or for expressing embodied experience, when in some ways, as you're saying, Joy, it's so elusive, or it's so, you know, it's so much bigger than the limit, you know, the body is limited in some ways and so concrete and bounded. And then the language of poetry is so much something else.
Interesting.
That sounded more like a statement than a question. Is
Yeah,
that right?
I guess my question is how you think about that relationship between poetry and embodiment, or how you use poetry to get at questions of the body, or to open up questions of the body, or make space for talking about the body in a different way.
Mm.
I mean, I can just try to take a stab at it a little bit. I think for me, part of Bloodlines is about breaking silences that were in my family about the body, specifically about this genetic mutation called BRCA. And I had a situation where my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer when she was 41. She died when she was 52 after a fight of her life. And all during that time, there was incredible silence in our family about what was going on. I mean, my mother was not told she had metastatic breast cancer. She was not told when she was dying. I wasn't told. And so part of the book are poems about what was happening to her body and things that I was never allowed to ask about, talk about, and so on. So the poems sort of became a tool for trying to just break through this silence, trying to find words for things that we were never allowed to speak about. And, you know, trying to reclaim, in a way, my mother's experience and my experience of living through that illness by talking very specifically about the body.
Mm.
And it's also, it's interesting that it's about the body, and it's about generations of bodies, right? Not just your body or her body, but the kind of lineage of bodies. So it gets at that question of inheritance as well, which I think can be one of the things that can be hard about writing about, you know, the ways that we can write bodies are on the one hand very personal, and writing about bodies is so personal, and on the other hand, so many other people are implicated in our writing about our bodies, right? Whether it's family members or lovers or children, you know, that sense of like how much you can explore your own internal sense and then also be not just writing about yourself. Go ahead.
No, I didn't want to interrupt. I was just thinking about just my own history, because I turned to poetry because I really couldn't speak English. I mean, English was like my fourth language, and I had tremendous trouble learning. I mean, it just plagued me, and even into graduate school. And I turned to poetry in my teens because I knew that, and I didn't show it to anybody because I thought I could do anything I want and nobody could tell me it was wrong, because in poetry, I mean, you could do anything, right? And what I ended up doing was writing a tremendous amount, mostly, and in fact, as I got older, I was really afraid of this, writing about the Holocaust only, obsessively. And it was only when I came out, which I consider my sort of jumping into the present, when I finally came out, which was not until I was 33, that my poetry expanded. And I stopped being so obsessed with the Holocaust, and I stopped being obsessed with the past and started sort of thinking about the present. And my first book of poetry, Periods of Stress, is probably, I mean, it was a coming out book collection. It was also had the sort of the remnants of my Holocaust poetry in it. But it was sort of my waking up to my body that allowed me to finally kind of expand my poetry, which included my body in some way. And I mean, it's sort of, I haven't thought of it quite in that way, but it's really true, because my poetry, after I came out, I started writing not just about the body, but a lot of things in the present, sort of, that maybe my body was encountering or in some way. I was suddenly physically in the now. So what you posed, I think, was sort of interesting to me. I hadn't thought of it quite that way before.
So far we've had, poetry emerging from a physical feeling or need, and poetry about bodies and cross-generational, and coming up with language for silenced aspects of bodies. Judith, what you were saying about the pandemic, I think connects to one of the weird things about poetry, which is that there are many kinds of poetry, and some poetry I don't think is directed to the body at all. Some of it I think is completely abstract. So I don't mean to characterize this, but if you look at traditional poetry and a lot of contemporary poetry, the goal is this weird goal of to create language which will enter someone else's body through the eyes and create feelings in the body of the person through their process of cognition as they interpret the language, as they sound out the syllables to themselves, as they feel cadences that come to a close, and of course, as they navigate meanings. We're hoping that something will change in the bodies of people. I remember I was going in workshops I started in the 1970s, and everybody, this was so tedious, everybody would talk about the breath and how poetry was about the breath. And I was like, I don't get this at all. I was dissociated, because of being trans, I had no connection to my body. I wrote poetry as a way of feeling alive outside of a body. And so I really didn't get the whole breath idea. I wanted to write lines that were so long that people would be gasping by the end of them. I didn't want to be, breathing in meter or anything like that. But once I started living in a body that felt more or less like my own, I did feel something that I was looking for language that wasn't exactly about my body mostly, or even about my feelings. There's something about physicality, and maybe it's because of all those years of dissociation. It always just feels hopelessly beyond language to me. And I think even my vocabulary of taste and feeling, it's terribly limited. And I don't have the excuse of knowing 3 other languages. I have no excuse. I know a lot. I have a lot of vocabulary for a lot of things. I've always been hyperverbal, but things connected to physical sensation, I just kind of give up on. So I started trying to write about this interface between the self and the body, which isn't quite writing about the body. It's more about it's like about the tension of being a self, which is not something that is really experienced as physical. It's like a set of meanings that are, localized in a physical form. And the body, which is of course the only way that anybody gets to be a self. And ultimately, through the physicality of our brains and nervous systems, that's you get a self otherwise. But it's that space or complicated relation between them that's the closest I think I've really come to writing about the body in a direct way.
So let's move into a little bit of reading, because I want to make sure, speaking of the difference between talking about poetry versus hearing it or reading it, and sort of what the physical response is, the ways that we kind of take it in, I'd love to make sure we get to hear some language. Joy, maybe let's start with you, because I'm interested in, well, tell us a little bit about your book, and this question of sort of where we take language from, I think comes up so interestingly in your book, because you're pulling from two different texts. Well, you tell us about the text that you're pulling from in this book.
Thank you, Judith. As I said, probably partly because of this strange trans history and impersonating a version of myself that I didn't identify with and all that mishigas, maybe not unlike being in the closet as a lesbian to some extent, where you know that there's a distance between who you're presenting yourself as and the self that you really locate as your own. But I've always been attracted to kind of impersonal or depersonalized language, and that reached an extreme in my latest book. I became interested in the Shekhinah, who in Jewish mystical tradition is the female aspect of the divine. And, because the way the patriarchal gender binary works, the female is the opposite and subordinate version of whatever is attributed to the male. So if the male aspect of divinity is transcendent, the female aspect of divinity is immanent, experiencing what human beings experience. The Shekhinah is seen as actually being with each of us and all of us. She dances at our weddings. She weeps at our funerals. She goes into exile with the people of Israel because, of course, the male aspect of divinity exiles, so the female aspect of divinity gets exiled. So the male aspect of divinity in Jewish tradition does a lot of talking, so the Shekhinah doesn't get to say anything. And I wanted to hear what she would say. And to do that, I didn't want to hear what I would say about her or as though I were her. I wanted to know what she would say. So I needed language that wasn't mine. So I started making poems out of words pulled from two very different kinds of texts. So one of them was passages from the prophet Isaiah, certified divine language. And the other were articles from Cosmopolitan magazine, which is kind of certified femme language. But I wanted them to relate to each other. They had to relate and connect to each other in some kind of way. And I would mush the words around until I started to hear a voice. And when what that voice said started to scare me, I knew I was getting close to the Shekhinah. The voice was always talking to a singular you. And I knew that by that you, she meant to be speaking to every single individual person. She felt she only needed one singular pronoun to refer to each of us, but all the poems are trying to get at everyone. So since we've been talking about bodies, she has a couple of poems about that. I wanted to read one called Your Body. So remember, she would prefer you to hear this as her talking to you.
We'll accept your voice for this, Joy.
Your body. You keep trying to escape the body I love, the blazing crush of physicality, impurity, and shame, separating you from yourself, from your soul, from me, the body I formed in your mother's womb, delivered, dandled, nursed, and comforted, the body that fails you in so many ways, through which you struggle to materialize, the way tomorrow struggles to materialize through today, blessing through pain, love through the flesh I made, to be a place where you and I can rest, hang out, go crazy for one another, marry, say goodbye, apologize, consume and burn like incense, plead, pledge, proclaim, be held and protected, given and accepted, born and born again. It's me you feel moving inside you, my presence that's so hard to reconcile with your sexual nature and the nature of sex, that sometimes you feel violated, devoured. Tell yourself that you're no good. Imagine me demanding you preach gospels of fire, gospels of bone, gospels of coming to an end. I didn't make you to end. I made you a whirlwind of appetites and offerings I never stop wanting. Ceremony and sacrifice, wine and reckoning, comedy, coolness, birthing and healing, falling in love, romance, yes, and sex. Your body is a stream from which I drink, a hand I hold, a nipple I lick, a story I tell over and over, a Sabbath I keep for pleasure, a way of being alone, a way of being together, my choir, my throne, my crazy music, my dog-eared paperback.
Wonderful.
I love how the Shekhinah in your poem is, you haven't given up any of the sense of the imminence of the Shekhinah, like she's so present and yet also active. Like I love that there is that sense of activeness, and the activeness is also in partnership. It's not, it's in relation. I mean, it's not active, like out ahead active. It's like relationally active in some way.
That's a really good way to put it. Yes. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yes.
Do you use can you say a little bit more about how you start with the Isaiah and the Cosmopolitan, and sort of, do you use those just as kind of the epigraph pieces and the inspiration, you know, the kind of juxtaposition, or is there a way in which they continue to weave through the poem as you're writing it?
You know, I use them the way that painters create palettes of paint. These are like little pots of diction. So I try not to read. When I try not to pay attention, which, you know, there's great poetry in Isaiah. It's hard not to pay attention to. But I can either read the poetry or I can do what I was there to do when working on these poems, which is just to try to be alert to language that grabs me. And I don't know why. Remember, I'm trying to get words that will allow somebody who's so beyond me to come through. So I don't know. I don't have an agenda here. So I'm just grabbing chunks of language. And the same thing with Cosmopolitan. Some of those articles they're quite interesting. Like that one was called Inside the Scam of the Purity Movement. But when I read it, I got nothing poetically from it. There was nothing in the poem that's really like, I mean, it's anti-purity movement, but wasn't what you don't need that article to write that.
Right.
So I just grabbing language that I want and literally mixing it together pretty randomly at first, then waiting for sentences to form, and then waiting for sentences to form and say something that I can make sense of. And so there are these different levels of review that have to be conscious. And I knew that the Shekhinah, actually, if I was able to really serve the Shekhinah, it would be language that would be all happening at the same time. It wouldn't be processable as phrases and sentences. Like the Shekhinah doesn't do sequentiality, she's simultaneous, but I can't do that. So I would look for sentences where it felt like meaning was happening all over the place, but in some way simultaneously, like not just thing, conclusion at the end of the sentence, but somehow every part of it is a now. And I would also look for it to be implicating in some way. Like I said, when it was saying things to the you that were actually also about me, really about me, and I got uncomfortable, I thought, okay, this is a voice that knows things about me more than what I know, more than what I want to know. This is getting to what I'm after.
And why Shekhinah? Like, what are you looking, like, what is theology doing for you? I mean, I know this is a topic that this isn't your first rodeo with God or whatever. That doesn't quite make sense, but your
I should
journey to
write about
theology.
that. I'm sorry. My rodeo, but with God, I think,
I'll look forward to that.
Yeah, so it grew out of, I actually ended up writing a book of theology. But before I wrote that, I'd been invited to a Shekhinah. That conference was really like a festival. They wanted Shekhinah poems, and I had some old Shekhinah poems, but they weren't really about the Shekhinah. I was in the closet, and I was using the Shekhinah, a disembodied female essence that persists no matter what happens in history or outside, and no one can see it, but it never goes away, and it pervades everything and is full of feeling in life. The Shekhinah is the sound of bells and wings, and the feeling of the chuppah, the feeling that you get under a chuppah, that's associated with the Shekhinah's presence. So like all of this stuff, I'm like, yeah, this is a pretty good way to talk about trans identification without actually risking anything by doing it. So I brought out my old Shekhinah poems. And I'm like, yeah, I still like these. These are fine, but let's try to pretend to be the Shekhinah. So I did. I masqueraded as the Shekhinah, and I made her say all the things I wished God would say, but didn't in the Torah. And I loved those poems. And then I wrote this book of theology. And when I went back to those poems, I'm like, oh, this is idolatry. This is literally what I was talking about in the theology book, how human beings create ideas of the divine that fit their own human ideas. And it's very cozy and comfortable when God coincides exactly with what we think. God votes the way we vote. God orders the way we order in a restaurant. We know that God and us, we're just like that. That's idolatry. And that's what I did with the Shekhinah. Of course, it was flattering, And so I thought, well, I have to trash these poems. Bummer. But I was hungry, and this really surprised me because I didn't ever feel like, what would God do with gender? I never thought God was gendered. I knew that was human mishigas, because nobody who didn't have a body, who didn't have to be gendered, why would they be gendered? So I was never interested in the Shekhinah theologically, but now I found myself hungry to hear her voice. I didn't even know why. It was just like, I do believe that God, I experience God as a presence that's with me, but it never occurred to me to listen for it in this kind of a way that the idea of the Shekhinah suggests is possible. And so that was what got me started.
I had never really thought before about the fact that the Shekhinah is silent. So I appreciate you calling my attention to that and providing us with some words and the permission to play with words in that way also, I think is a really important piece of that kind of opening up that possibility for that kind of like wild juxtaposition, and that something divine could come out of that, right? That it's not a bastardization of language, it's actually a possibility for something really beautiful and bursting with potential.
The first rule of Shekhinah speaking is the Shekhinah speaks any way she wants to. And I feel like that's a pretty empowering thing to remember as a poet.
Yeah. Irena, let's move on to you. I want very much to hear what you choose to read from your collection. And it's quite a task to choose, I'm sure, because your collection covers 50 years. So give us a taste of something, and then I'd love to hear also what it was like to try to put together something that pulls so much of your work from different periods into conversation with itself.
Well, I decided to pick a poem because Israel is so much on my mind, and so many, I know a lot of Jews, most Jews are very, very preoccupied with what's been going on. I wrote this poem at the beginning of the First Intifada in I don't know, there's something. All right. And I wrote this at the beginning of I think it was 88, the beginning of the First Intifada. And one of the reasons I wrote it was because I was doing a lot of activism, and I was trying to figure out how to reach people and stuff. And I couldn't, and one of the things that I sort of started thinking about was what was my own attitude about the occupation when the first 67 war happened. And I realized I had changed a great deal from those moments. And so this poem is really, I mean, I have to say it's obviously a political poem that you would think would be outdated. And one of the really more depressing things to me about this poem is that it's so not undated and so relevant to now. So I just like to read it. I wrote it about in 67, during the 67 war, or the 6-Day War, I was in Chicago in graduate school. And just around the time of the war, there had been a mass murder in Chicago by Richard Speck. He had killed 7 student nurses, and there was a hunt out for him, and he hadn't been located. They knew who he was, and they couldn't find him. And at the same time, I had an Israeli friend and her sister visiting, which was just bizarre because they had both been in the army, and the war was so quick. They had planned this trip that they were still able to come to the United States right after this war. So that's sort of the setting of this poem, which I think is more understandable if you read it rather than if you just hear it, which is, there's no preface to it, actually. It's called 67 Remembered, and it's for Hannah. In 67, you visited with your sister. I was in Chicago. Richard Speck had just murdered 7 nurses. We were scared. The war was only a few days over, and everyone said how well you and Gittel looked. Who would have thought you'd just come from a war-torn country, dressed chic in late 60s fashion, smiling, easy, relaxed, confident the worst was over. I still have the photographs. How different that war from that other in your life. Siberia, the Germans at your heels, your father chopping trees in the forest. You learned Russian in the street, spoke Yiddish at home, wrote Polish in the segregated schools. You were a linguist at 8, ready to master even more tongues for the sake of survival. But in 67, you'd already mastered it all. You were so relaxed, so easy. It was a joke, this war, despite the casualties. It was a joke how relaxed you were. And wasn't I too? Weren't we all? Didn't we all glow from it, our sense of power finally achieved? The quickness of the action, the biblical roots, and how we laughed over Egyptian shoes in the sand, how we laughed at another people's fear as if fear was alien, as if we had known safety all our lives. And the West Bank, I don't remember it mentioned by any of us. We were in Chicago. It was hard to imagine. But 20 years later, I hear how they picked up what they could, placed it on their backs, how they marched through the hills, sparse, coarse grass, pink and yellow flowers, rough rocks defying cultivation, how they carried clumsy packs, clothing, utensils, images of a home they might never see again. As Sabra told me, who watched their leaving as she sat safe in an army jeep, it looked no different than the newsreels at school of French and Belgian roads. It was simple, she said. People were fleeing, and we egged them on. Time passes, everything changes. We see things differently. In 67, you had not married yet, and we all wondered why, never worrying about marriage laws or rabbinic power. And now, more than 20 years later, you live in Jerusalem, ruling from your lacquered kitchen, and sit in that dream house trapped. Enough food in your mouth, in your children's, and enough warm things for winter, coats, shoes, woolen stockings, good for Siberia. And there's no way out, no one to call about a bad marriage. It's simple. A woman with bruises, without bruises, your lawyer says, there's not much hope, and you accept it. You say, I can't say I'm happy, but I've got a truth. Things fester, we compromise, we wake up, take new positions to suit new visions, failed dreams. We change. Power does not so much corrupt as blur the edges, so we no longer feel the raw fear that pounds in the hearts of those trapped and helpless. In 67 in Chicago, we thought we'd be safe, locking the windows till Speck was caught. We did not know there was a danger in us as well, that we must remain vigilant and open, not to power, but to peace.
Beautiful. Thank you. It's chilling, really, and it makes me think about all the debates we have now, all the, not even debates, but the heightened sensitivity around analogies, around historical analogies. And of course, all we have are analogies. That's how we understand things, is by making comparisons and by trying to parse them. And I, to see the layers of history in your poem as you look back from 88 to 67 to the war, and try to make sense of that and think about what that means personally, and then also on national levels, is quite striking. And where danger comes from, does it come from outside or does it come from inside, or what even is inside?
Yeah. What's really depressing is I don't think I would have written it differently now. I mean, obviously, but it's shocking in some ways. It's just very shocking.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in some ways now, from this perspective now, many years later, we actually understand even more what the impact of the Holocaust was on the trauma that is being played out in Israel right now. I think you were probably sort of prescient in seeing that in the 80s. And I think it is even more obvious now than it was then, right? There's a way in which we can see that coming through in this very unresolved kind of way.
Yep.
But also, as the poem is pointing out, not coming through at all, because what I love, I was going to say, I love the way the poem weaves together different things. And that's true. That's something I always want to do, and I can't do it at all. So my hat is off to you for that. But what I really love is that it doesn't feel that way at all. It just felt like there was an unwavering eye toward the human, individual, and sort of social soul's relation to these events, and the degree to which people were able to see other suffering as the suffering of human beings, as akin to their own suffering, or were not, and just a very unwavering gaze, somehow both unsparing and deeply compassionate.
Well, I grew up among Holocaust survivors, and I remember that a lot of them were involved in resistance during the war. And I remember the kind of, and I experienced it too, it was a kind of exhilaration about this war, this power, that Jews were able to do this when a lot of these people experienced just helplessness during the war. So there was this spontaneous, oh my God, and I have also felt that too, that it was almost impossible not to feel it and to sort of forget that you were once on the other side, and it was very easy, and it was sort of understandable. I don't really blame them for feeling that, of people who had never felt power of any sort and had watched, helplessly all the atrocities that they experienced. So it was a very complicated kind of moment, I think, but one which we should have pulled out of. Which should have sort of with time. And I had it too. I don't know when I lost it. I don't know when I started seeing it differently.
Were there many moments as you were putting this collection together where you kind of rediscovered poems that spoke to you in a particularly, different or not different way now?
It's really interesting. I don't know whether any of you've had this also experience. One of the things that I discovered was that I had discovered certain things earlier, and I'd forgotten that I discovered them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether you've had that experience. I thought, oh my God, I really thought this 30 years ago. I thought I just found out last week.
We need to keep learning and relearning.
I know that was very, very bizarre. And it was a strange experience to go all the way back to some of the poems I included, I just found very awkward, the early ones, but I wanted to include them because I felt they were sort of part of my process and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I changed. We all change. And so it was interesting to go back and especially this business of discovering things that I thought that I only recently discovered that I had actually thought 30, 40 years ago, and I just didn't remember. I'd forgotten them.
Mm-hmm. Or they were
well, it's like going to therapy, and you sort of repeat the same thing. That's why it takes so long, because you keep forgetting what you learn.
right. Well, maybe it's
there's
actually
sort
more
of
like
a sense of also like what is visible and what is not visible.
right.
I found one of the moments in the poem that just really, I kind of like almost gasped, is this thing of the woman couldn't get a divorce because there were no visible bruises.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of what torture, what pain, what inflicted violence of different kinds is visible and not visible seems to be a thread in the poem that's incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And we were so eager for her to get married. We thought, hurry up, kind of get married.
Right. And throughout the poem, there's a lot there's a lot of pain and trauma that's below the surface, but is influencing everyone. And let's thank you for your patience. Let's turn to you. I'd love to hear from you.
Sure. So my book, as I said, has grown out of trying to come to terms with a sort of complex family history. Not that everybody's isn't complex, but trying to really trace this genetic experience and trying to also look at legacy and inheritance in a way that is not about genes. There's a lot in the book that's about all different kinds of things that I've inherited, starting with, a love of the Jewish tradition to a love of art. My mother was a sculptor, a love of writing. My aunt was a writer and a journalist. There's so many different kinds of inheritance and legacies that are not genetic. And yet there was this genetic thread that was really very powerful in shaping the length of lives, but not necessarily the power of example and the lives that were lived. The book has a kind of narrative thread. There's 6 prose poems that start with my great-grandmother Rivka, and go through my maternal grandmother, and then my mother and my aunt. And my grandmother died at 41 of ovarian cancer. My aunt and my mother both died of breast cancer, one in their late 40s, one in their early 50s. And then I didn't find out until my late 50s that I even had this gene, because the gene wasn't discovered until 94, and I wasn't tested until 2006. But aside from tracing that family history, it's also my own sort of journey from, as I said, grief to, learning how to live in this world with joy and gratitude and a sense of life continuing, and not being frozen by the fear that every little twitch I felt or every little lump I felt in my body was cancer. And that was a very circuitous, nonlinear process of moving from grief to gratitude. And nothing is obviously, is never all one or all the other. So I'm going to read a poem that I actually I've been doing a lot of readings, which has been wonderful, but I don't usually read this poem, but I decided to read it tonight. And I think it resonates particularly with this issue of embodied fear, embodied connection with the divine, the search for the divine. I feel like a special connection with the Shekhinah poems, although that's not sort of directly what this is about. But it is a soul searching, soul seeking journey of discovery. Okay, it's called Hiking the Mountains of Moab. The epigraph is Grand Junction, Colorado, which is where this happened. A woman alone in the desert, a familiar fear, brush away cobwebs of what if. The trail is steep, muscles in my legs begin to ache. I am walking, working, climbing. Without warning, a loud sound, large rocks falling, a change in the weather, sleeping boulders grinding together. I cannot name it, cannot quell the urge to label it, to claim it. The path curves and slivers, tiny wildflowers nestle in rock crevices, fuchsia and white, deep red, blood orange. I pretend the palette of petals relieves the tightness in my chest. I continue to climb. In my mind, I am turning back. In my heart, I am moving forward to find the fossilized plants, discover the dinosaur bones, peer into pits where archaeologists labored. A large lizard darts across my path. The tightness in my chest moves down my legs. Ascending onto a flat rock, the lizard ignores my presence. Pink tongue licks the air. Colors pull me closer. Skin bright turquoise, neck encircled in black, head crowned in gold. My heart pounds. The lizard's belly moves rhythmically in, out, in, out. The lizard's breathing, my own breathing, a quickening of awe, Baruch atah.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
I was very taken with the variation of forms in your book, which pieces you chose to write as sort of prose poems and which as more traditional poems. How did that evolve? How did you think about that?
I think, I felt that there was somewhat of a narrative story that I wanted to tell. I wanted to be able to speak about particular things that I learned about my grandmother, about my aunt, that just seemed like they were more kind of social history than poetry. But I think prose poems are still poems. I mean, they're not straightforward narratives. So, I tried to, for one thing, make them linked to various photographs that are in the book. And there's the prose poem about my grandmother. There's a photograph of her and my grandfather, a wedding portrait. And it turns out that her white wedding slippers were very important to me in my childhood growing up games about pretending to be a grown-up. But I never knew they were her shoes. And so the prose poem about my grandmother has some just historic things about her role in World War I, but then there's this element of this clothing passed down and the fantasies that I was allowed to enter in my own mind every time I wore her white wedding slippers. So, there's, it kind of goes back and forth. They're not poems in the way that the other poems are, like more traditional lyric poems. But I hope they have poetic elements in them. And I think that the searching and seeking and the memories are more appropriate to lyric poetry. I had so many memories of times with my mother that I was just like struggling to keep remembering them so I wouldn't lose them. And it was very liberating to put them in poems, to have them live on the page and not to have to worry about remembering them and not to have to worry about losing them and not to have to worry about losing her again. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but
Yeah. I loved the photos, and I loved the relationship between the photos and the prose poems, and the shoes really struck me, especially because shoes are they're both like, so they carry so much, they do so much cultural work, especially for women. And they're also like, they're out there, but they're also hidden, right? Especially in a wedding dress, they're sort of like peeking out. And once you see them, you can't not see them because they're striking, but you don't see them right away. And so I feel like they're like language in a poem, right? It's like, it's there, but it's hidden. And so much of your poetry is about what's hidden and what you're calling out and articulating. And I loved that so much. And I really appreciated the work you did to weave the family piece and the internal bodily pieces, and where the stories of history and different kinds of inheritances weave together. It's as both a historian and as someone with a similar history in my own family, it spoke to me so much. I am so sad that we don't have more time tonight. I'm just like aching to talk about so many more things, and I know our audience is too. We're going to have another opportunity to explore further, but this was such a wonderful beginning, and I am so grateful for all of your generosity to share and to talk and to engage in this conversation with me and with one another. And thanks to all of you who are in the room with us. There's also, of course, always more to explore at JWA. We have many pieces in our encyclopedia that touch on some of the things that we talked about tonight around poetry, we didn't really talk about Irena's Yiddish and English melded poems, but there is a lot to explore there. And we have work on Yiddish women's poetry in our encyclopedia too, as well as individual entries on Joy and on Irena. We'll share also, I think Mickey just put it in the chat, the recording of the poetry session we did with Joy and a few other poets a couple of years ago. This is the last session of this series of book talks, which is why we squeezed so much into this last session to make sure that we could feature all three of you. We have more virtual programs coming after Passover. Those are going to be our online history courses. In April and May, we're doing a course on women and resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto in partnership with the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. That will be at a new time for us to accommodate our European partner, Tuesdays at noon Eastern time, beginning on April 18th until May 16th, and you can register at jwa.org/events. In June, we will return to our usual Thursday night schedule with a new course that we have not yet announced, but that's in the works, called Beyond the Gender Binary. So stay tuned for more information on that coming soon. Until next time, wishing you all a liberating Passover. May we enter into a period of renewal and possibility that is hard to see right now, but that's the joy of miracles. They bring things that we can't see from this side of the sea. Thank you all so much. I look forward to gathering with you again soon, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Judith.
Thank you, everyone.